This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Nina and Jan, for this warm welcome and the invitation and for having me. Thank you all for coming. I hope you will enjoy the talk. So my talk is titled 3 Pictures of Global Health Justice, and what I'm going to try to do is to understand tonight together with you when are international health inequalities unjust or should be considered matters of global justice and should be considered problems of justice rather than problems of a different moral concern. And when we have that, what justice requires, who is to act, how and why, for what reason. And to quickly put my cards on the table in case somebody zooms out of the talk, I think that some health inequalities are matters of global justice, but not all of them. Some of them are matters of domestic justice, and some of them are matters of humanitarian concern. And this is not very surprising. Most philosophical accounts will have a pluralistic moral considerations with regards to global health and health deprivations. I think, however, that there is a wider scope for justice in global health than we currently acknowledge, and we can include more health deprivations under the banner of justice than commonly thought. And I will try to show you this by, besides discussing 2 prominent views in the literature, I try to provide some considerations for developing what I call a global relational egalitarian account of health justice. And it hopes to provide a novel answer to the question what makes some health inequalities matters of global justice. So why do I talk about pictures of justice? To the disappointment of some of you, probably, I will not be showing you beautiful pictures tonight. Maybe I should, but the title refers to Rainer Forst's essay titled 2 Pictures of Justice, and he borrows the term pictures of justice from Wittgenstein. He writes, Forst writes that a picture shapes our language about a certain topic. It brings together the various usages of a word and thus constitutes its grammar. That is how we understand and use a word. But such pictures can also point our understanding of something in the wrong direction, much as in viewing the famous picture puzzle of a duck and a rabbit. One can see only one aspect at a time, or as our thinking is determined by particular examples that lead us to false generalizations. So a picture of justice expresses a general and a thick way of thinking about justice and injustice. So basically what Forst is trying to do here is to think about the way our notions of justice are structured in a normative sense, and they both open up ways of thinking about justice in a certain way but also close it down in other ways. And so what I do here is basically draw up a normative structure for currently existing accounts of global health justice, and I consider basically 5 basic elements of the normative structure, and I would like to use this 5-dimensional normative structure to think about what is positive, what is welcome aspect of these conceptions of global health justice, and perhaps what we should rethink and work towards what I call this relational egalitarian account. So the first element that I will be talking about is the role or the nature of health in a theory of justice. And here the question that normally comes up is whether health is special and the distribution of health can be isolated from other aspects of person's personal or social life, or as some others think, part of the basis of human well-being or human flourishing, or perhaps in an even different way, health is fundamentally constitutive part of our life prospects as autonomous agents or overall advantages. In any case, a global account of health justice must decide how to think about the role and the nature of health in a global context, and whether this global aspect is going to make us rethink the nature and the role of health in a theory of justice. The second element of this normative structure concerns the origins of ill health. right? So typically we sort of think about the origin of health as naturally occurring natural causes of ill health, social or socially determined health deprivations, and we also think about our personal responsibility in bringing about certain illnesses. And the question for a normative theory is whether the differential treatment of the causes of health deprivations is morally justified or not. So that's this kind of second aspect. The third aspect or element of a conception here is the ground of justice. Why we have obligations to remedy health deprivations, and this is going to be a particularly difficult task in the global realm, where our sort of the scope of justice or our duties of justice are not so thickly embedded in our global relations of solidarity and equal concern. The fourth element is what I call, and has come to be known in the literature as the site of justice, and this aspect refers to sort of what is the kind of thing to which a principle of justice will apply? What is it that we are evaluating with terms of justice and injustice? What sort of things should be brought under evaluation? And again, there are many possibilities. Are we looking at the distribution of health in society or in the global realm, distributions of life expectancy, for example? Are we looking at actions, what people do to others, or maybe institutionally mediated actions, and how we design our joint institutions and what effect they have on people? So there are again several possibilities here. And finally, the fifth element is the principle of justice. What does justice require here? And whether the moral concern lies with absolute health deprivations or relative inequalities in health, and what is owed to persons is some minimal or decent level of health, or that we close the gap along a whole spectrum of health inequalities. So these are the five elements: the role, the origins of ill health, the ground of justice, site of justice, and the principle of justice. And I think that the differences stem from very deep philosophical controversies concerning the nature and the purpose of theorizing about justice and how it applies to the particular domain of health. So what I'm going to argue in the proposal, sort of the constructive part of the paper, is I argue that a core of a plausible and yet unexplored conception of global health justice is the idea of equal standing in global affairs, or equal standing in a global political community. Global justice requires that we establish relations of equal standing in our global affairs and protect it from eroding over time. Distributional questions in terms of valuable goods, such as health, arise not on their own terms, in my view, but they arise in relation to this particular ideal. Health, or being healthy, is constitutive of and instrumental to relations of equal standing in global affairs. So the question for global health justice is about our health status, its causes, and the way it affects our capacity to stand as an equal member of this global community. Which kind of health deprivations give rise to claims of justice, and which are not plausible claims of justice, can be derived from what we owe to each other in a global community of equals in terms of protecting and promoting each other's health. With reference to the engaging philosophical debate on the value of equality, I call this position a relational egalitarian account of global health justice. And I will conclude that health inequalities are matters of global justice when they result from an unfair arrangement of the global political determinants of health, where global arrangements are fair, when first they have a fair global health impact, second, they mitigate the effects of socially determined ill health on grounds of equal respect, and they also mitigate the effects of natural health deprivations on the basis of equal respect for persons. So these are going to be the three requirements. Now, of course, especially for those of you who are not philosophers in the room, it's important to see what is at stake when we are arguing for a particular conception of justice in global health. I think first it is important to clarify and strengthen the idea that duties to address certain health deprivations worldwide are duties of justice and not merely problems of humanitarian concern or charity. Moreover, different conceptions of justice will disagree about what we owe to each other in terms of health and why. It is likely that plausible conceptions will overlap, for example, in their demands of eradicating extreme health deprivations worldwide. So we have a plurality of moral reasons to address these most egregious health-related harms and wrongs, and this, I believe, is a welcome consequence of our moral reasoning. However, the normative grammar of global health justice has important implications for the kind of actions and the policies it demands, and the nature and the extent of our global obligations. And given the extent of the global burden of disease and the limited resources we have to address it, normative theory needs to provide clear guidance on how to set priorities for global health action. So I think these are some of the reasons why it makes sense to debate these things at the philosophical level and come to some conclusions and hopefully some normative shift in our understanding. Okay, so starting with the first picture of global health justice, it might be familiar to some of you. I'm going to basically address two pictures before I move on to developing the third one. I'm going to first talk about the health capability approach as it is developed by Sridhar Venkatapuram. Second, I will be addressing causal relationalism, most prominent in Thomas Pogge's account of global health justice. And finally, I try to motivate my view on this relational egalitarian approach. So starting with the health capability approach. An influential account of global health justice grew out of efforts to rethink the capabilities approach pioneered by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum for the case of health. So one way to think about the problem is to explore what the capability to be healthy entails and what sort of claims and obligations it gives rise to, as Sridhar Venkatapuram does in his 2011 book. So, how does Venkatapuram understand the role and the nature of health? Generally, the capability approach values health both intrinsically and instrumentally. Health is an intrinsic good in and of itself, constituting our well-being. At the same time, it is instrumental to other valuable capabilities. Venkatapuram departs from this orthodox understanding of health within the capability approach and endorses a broader view of health, encompassing valuable doings and beings for a dignified human life, as he says. Being healthy, on his view, is a meta-capability, including other basic capabilities. He develops a positive notion of health as opposed to the standard absence of disease view, and argues, quoting, health should be seen as a cluster of basic capabilities, end quote. Which capabilities are to be included and on what grounds are ideas that he borrows from Nussbaum's version of the capabilities approach. So the capability to be healthy encompasses the 10 central human capabilities that Nussbaum has on her list, and persons are entitled to a sufficient level of each necessary for a dignified human life. So basically, the entitlement that persons have to this capability to be healthy, because it basically derives from the Nussbaumian view, is implicit in Nussbaum's notion of human dignity. So here's the sort of the role and the nature of health within the first picture of justice. What about the origins of ill health? Venkatapuram's view stands on another important pillar that makes his account of global health justice what I call a hybrid capabilities view. The social determinants of health plays a crucial role in his theory. First, these social determinants have a particularly relevant causal role in the explanation of preventable impairments and premature death. They co-determine a person's health status in interaction with other factors. These other factors are biological causes, individual behavior, and the external physical environment. So it's a co-determining role that these social determinants have. But more importantly, social determinants also act as causes of causes, as Venkatapuram calls them, influencing and potentially magnifying the biological, behavioral, and environmental effects on health. This empirical role of the social determinants of health is crucial because it's going to provide perhaps the most important site of public action and significantly extend its scope. Whenever intervention is feasible, it is a requirement of health justice to eliminate the social causes that limit the exercise of a person's capability to be healthy. In Venkatapuram's words, every human being has a moral entitlement to the social bases of an equitable capability to be healthy, end quote. So then to his principle of justice, the third element in the view. The distributive principle is a hybrid principle, in my view. On the one hand, it has a particular principle of distribution and an outcome pattern in mind in terms of the relevant metric, which is the sufficiency in health capability for all. On the other hand, this result is achieved in his picture in a procedural way. So it's not only a standard to evaluate patterns or distributions of health, but it also tells us something about how this should come about. So it's achieved in a procedural way by rearranging the social basis of health. So the correct arrangement of the social basis is evaluated through the lens of a specific outcome in mind that provides the standard of evaluation for its reorganization. If we want to apply Elizabeth Anderson's categories of distributive rules here, and again for those philosophers who are particularly interested in theories of distributive justice, his view is a pattern-sensitive constrained procedural rule. It requires that all enjoy a sufficient level of opportunity to be healthy, where this opportunity arises from certain ways of social organization. So what is the fourth element, the site of justice for Venkatapuram? As I said, he has in mind an ideal distributive pattern that we should constrain by our ideas of justice in terms of this chosen health capability metric. However, a person's entitlement is not to a level of health capability per se, but to its social basis. For a society to be just, the social basis would have to be organized in a way that they together promote sufficient level of health capability necessary for a dignified life. Finally, to the grounds of justice, and here I'm going to raise a couple of questions or concerns as well. Venkatapuram's grounding of his account, Venkatapuram grounds his account in the idea of human dignity, and this, according to him, automatically going to lend itself to a global scope of justice. All persons' entitlements to basic capabilities are pre-political in nature. Persons have these claims prior to and independently of belonging to a particular political community. Once these universal claims are recognized, the actions of individuals and social structures from the local to the global can be judged to be good or bad in relation to the capabilities. While it is not entirely clear what is meant by being judged in relation to something, I take it that Venkatapuram envisions the idea of global health justice in the following way. I think that according to him, all persons have justified claims to basic capabilities necessary for a dignified human life, and it is the duty of everyone else recognizing humanity in the claimants to make sure that their actions and the multi-level social and global structures affecting these capabilities work towards achieving the aim. Now, to raise a couple of problems with Venkatapuram's health capability approach. I think that the problem is at least twofold here, and we've made this argument in a 2016 issue of Bioethics with two colleagues of mine from Münchner, Alena Büchs and Sebastian Laukötter. So we've argued that first, people's entitlements to the capability to be healthy is derived from the idea of human dignity. So the reason why people have valid claims is based on their feature as human beings, and the reason why others have an obligation to assist them in reaching a threshold level in their health capability is because they recognize this humanity in the claimants. We thought that this is not an account of justice proper, but claims of justice are grounded in humanity, so this is going to be basically a principle of humanity, and I'll explain in a second why that might be problematic for our purposes. And I think the second problem, which I will just mention now in bracket, not to be too long, there is an ambiguity regarding his site of justice between health deprivations that are socially caused versus those that are socially controllable or socially remediable. And both of these elements have important normative implications for purely natural health deprivations. So why do we think that grounding the global health duty in an account of humanity is problematic here? What is the moral basis of our duty to alleviate health deprivations worldwide? That's sort of the question that we're trying to answer. And to use the term unjust and injustice, and to basically use the evaluative term justice very broadly, and condemn every form of human deprivation, independently of its nature or origin and the underlying rationale to address it, is problematic. As Brian Barry noted, it may, quoting, result in the blunting of our moral vocabulary and therefore to a loss of precision in our moral thinking. By contrast, Barry distinguishes a principle of humanity that is goal-based with the aim to alleviate suffering or advance well-being from a principle of justice that is rights-based with the aim of settling legitimate entitlements. They have very different rationales and very different implications for practice. On Venkatapuram's view, health claims are based on a judgment about the level and kind of capability necessary to sustain one's status as a human being. And even if the idea of minimal human well-being is not expressed in terms of basic needs or functioning, it still remains a goal-based threshold account of well-being. People are owed a minimally dignified life, expressed in terms of this sufficient health capability for all, and actions and institutions need to be aligned to realize that goal. Whenever persons fall below that threshold, a humanitarian duty is called for. It is important to point out that the difference between humanity and justice is not that the duty of humanity is a weaker moral requirement. Humanitarian duties fall short of duties of justice not because they are morally less obligatory, nor because they cannot be legitimately enforced, but most plausibly because they are not meant to track entitlements. They do not help define what people justly possess or hold. It makes a difference whether someone falls short of her status of humanity through no fault of anyone, or someone is denied what is legitimately belongs to her. One important consequence for health is that a duty of humanity is independent from the origin or cause of health deprivation the claimant is suffering. Its rationale, as Barry calls it, is to relieve distress, no matter what caused it. In this sense, Venkatapuram's health capability view is morally blind to the cause of disease, and people are owed basic health capabilities, whether their deprivation is due to misfortune, genetic lottery, accidents, natural disasters, whether they brought it on themselves or it results from social action or institutional design. I will argue that the idea of being blind to the origins of ill health is not necessarily a bad thing. I think this might be a welcome feature of the capabilities approach that we can bring to bear on the relational egalitarian approach as well. However, what sets the threshold is human dignity, I think, is misguided in this case. And I want to argue for a more plausible version of equal standing in global affairs as a more plausible public political ideal for purposes of justice. So it is not only necessary to make a clear distinction between claims of humanity and claims of justice and avoid any attempt to define one in terms of the other, it might also be necessary to establish a priority, a logical priority between the two, since the demands of the former may well depend on the latter being in place or not. So in a way, as Barry argued, there is a logical priority between justice and humanity. As Barry says, we cannot sensibly talk about duties of humanity until we have a baseline set by justice. To talk about what I ought as a matter of humanity, to do with what is mine, makes no sense until we have established what is mine in the first place. So unless just entitlements are in place, we cannot have full confidence that what we give as a matter of humanity is not what we already owe as a matter of justice, right? So if what I give, what is mine, is unjustly so, then it is not my place to give, but my duty to return. Okay, so otherwise I would simply return what rightfully belongs to the other in the guise of humanitarian aid. Okay, so I will close here with the discussion of the Venkatapuram view or the health capability view, and not leave aside other smaller problems with the view, and move on to the second picture of global health justice. Paul Kelleher and myself in different places called causal relationism. The second picture of global health justice is a causal relational account of global health justice. Shortly I will call it causal relationism, most prominent in Thomas Pogge's work. His main contention with theories that have a distributive pattern side is similar of what I've just mentioned in relation to the Venkatapuram view. So the contention is that these distributive patterns fail to give plausible moral guidance where guidance is urgently needed for the assessment and reform of social rules, as well as of subjects and their conduct, end quote. This is due to the fact that their moral evaluation is overly focused on the distribution of goods or ills among persons, or among the recipients, what ought recipients to be able to do or to have. As a consequence, they are blind, morally speaking, regarding the origins of ill health. Whether health inequalities merely happen to exist, or they are brought about, is a distinction of great moral import that these theories, according to Pogge, fail to appreciate. So the most innovative and at the same time most controversial element of Pogge's theory of global health justice is shifting the site of justice, right? So we're talking about the third element now. The site of justice from a distributive pattern to institutional treatment, or what Pogge calls the implicit attitude of institutions. From a passive concept of justice to an active concept, from justice as promoting a just distribution to justice as treating people justly. He invites us to focus on the agents and think about injustice as something that is done or not to the recipients of ill health. And this allows him to draw a sharp divide between the social origins of ill health that are matters of justice, according to Pogge, and the natural origins of ill health that are not matters of justice. Notice, of course, that not all theories that work with a distributive pattern are indifferent regarding the origins of ill health. At the core of a prominent approach known as Locke Egalitarian Ism is the idea that a just distribution should reflect the consequences of people's choices and should not reflect the factors that contribute to their ill health through no fault of their own. This view treats both the effects of natural and social causes to be problematic from the point of view of justice, given that both are beyond the individual's control. By contrast, it singles out free and unconstrained individual choices and allows their effects to reflect in the overall distribution of goods. So in a way, not all distributive patterns have to be blind to these origins, but they're going to cluster the relevant origins of ill health, those that are relevant for justice, in a very different way. Right? So while the Locke Egalitarian view takes the social and natural origins to be problems of justice and sort of the personal origins or the personal choice origins as not problems of justice, Pogge takes the humanly caused or socially engendered health deprivations as providing stronger moral reasons for addressing them, they are matters of justice, while naturally occurring ones as not matters of justice. So it's important where we draw the divide and which category belongs to which box. So back to Pogge's central thesis. He holds that, according to a rather well-known quote, the strength of our moral reasons to prevent or to mitigate particular medical condition depends not only on distributional factors, rather it depends also on relational factors, that is, on how we are related to the medical conditions they suffer, end quote. Notice that it's very clear from this quote already that the distribution versus relation is not an either-or question for Pogge. Distributions do matter morally, but it also matters whether and how agents are related to health deprivations. Agents may be unrelated, they may be directly causing them, or they might be indirectly implicated in upholding institutions that impact on them in various ways. To nuance the problem of injustice even further, in addition to this causal role, Pogge stresses the importance of the implicit attitude of social institutions. He distinguishes between 6 ways in which institutions may affect people's health conditions, and they correspond to the strength of our moral reasons to mitigate them. Now, these categories are presented as a scalar view from negative to positive responsibility, and it is not clear in his case how we should draw the line or whether we should be drawing the line between injustice and those deprivations that are not matters of justice. So the site of justice, as it's probably already clear, the things that we're supposed to be evaluating with the standard of justice in Pogge's case is a rather complex matter. It is part a distributive pattern, it's part an institutional treatment. And some people read Pogge as categorically drawing the line between medical conditions we are causally related to, and these are problems of justice, those we are unrelated to as matters of moral concern of a different kind. More often, however, in some of his other work, they are presented as matters of degree, cases of greater versus lesser injustice. The conceptual picture that he draws up, it draws a very sharp line in the causal history of health deprivations. Some causes originate in events independently of society and its institutions, while other causes originate in social action. This distinction makes sense in the abstract when we apply the active concept of justice, because for something to be unjust, certain agents must have or share responsibility for the injustice of this judicandum, of this site. Purely natural judicanda, such as pure genetic causes of disease, are not capable of being just or unjust in this sense. They are not matters of justice in the sense that there is no institutional standpoint from where those carrying the burden of disease were treated unjustly. There are two complications, however, both of which are explicitly acknowledged by Pogge, sometimes only in a footnote, which render his picture of global health justice more nuanced than the common reading of this causal relational view would suggest. The first concern the way natural inequalities are entangled in their origins with social inequalities. Second, and I think more importantly for moral theorizing, even if purely natural deprivations are not matters of justice, the way society is organized and its institutions deal with the effects of natural health deficits is or may be a matter of justice. So I'm going to just quickly go through the way I think it's already present in Pogge's work, and it will help us move on to the next picture. So first, natural causes of illness are rarely independent of social inequalities. Much of our most advanced biomedical research finds that many physical and mental diseases of apparently biological origins are deeply rooted in social inequalities. The social determinants of health approach has mounted evidence for this claim for a great variety of health deprivations, ranging from coronary heart disease through mental illness to sleep disorders. Our prenatal and early childhood development is particularly sensitive to our social and family environment that profoundly shapes our brain and our body. Latest epigenetic findings suggest that even genetic causes are sensitive to the environment in which they are expressed. The relationship between natural and social health inequalities are complex and intertwined, and the more we learn from biomedical research and social epidemiology, the more restricted the domain of what philosophers like to call the purely naturally occurring ill health becomes. As Pogge writes, quoting, "First, the distinction between natural and social components of human quality of life cannot be drawn clearly enough and is not significant enough to bear the great moral weight we placed upon it." End quote. It is wrong, overly simplistic, to think of any seemingly natural medical condition as an ill which occurs prior and independently of social relations, and persons as entering society with them. More importantly, the distinction is not significant enough to carry the weight of the moral division between justice and injustice. The second complication in this social and natural domain of health. So second, purely natural causation occurs in a social institutional environment. It is one thing to say that the origins of a particular disease cannot be just or unjust, but how the effect of the natural cause is played out in society is often deeply entangled with various forms of unjust institutional treatment. How people are affected by and able to cope with the effect of naturally occurring disease may nevertheless be unjust due to existing inequities. As Pogge writes, the devastating effects of a hurricane or the fact that a disease outbreak turned into an epidemic may still be traceable to an injustice in factors under human control, such as a flawed economic or healthcare system under which safe buildings or vaccines are unaffordable to the poor. End quote. So what is just or unjust is not how these natural goods or ills are occurring, but how institutions deal with their effects on people's overall life prospects. So Pog acknowledges the way the social and the natural are intertwined. Still, the social origins remain, in his view, a priority maker for public action. Indeed, it seems that precisely the newly discovered social nature or social feature of what we thought to be a natural inequality before is what brings them into the realm of justice. So I think that there's still something to think about when it comes to extending our accounts of justice to natural inequalities, independently of whether they are intertwined with the social in its origins or in its effects. The second problem that I see with Pogge's account, and I think that this will sort of lead us to the next picture, I think that his account of what it means for institutions to treat people justly is to mitigate the effects of socially, institutionally caused ill health and allow naturally occurring health deficits. It zooms in on the positive or the negative health effects, the burdens and the benefits that institutions generate, and still leave unaddressed the pre-existing or pre-institutional health deficits, assuming that they still exist. This, however, is only one way of cashing out the content of what a just institutional treatment is, and it draws on a particular moral understanding of the doing versus allowing distinction. One may even say that this is a rather narrow way of understanding what it means for an institution to treat a person in a certain way. The idea of treating people justly does not yield a conclusive answer to which health inequalities are matters of justice. What does it mean to treat people justly, and what does just institutional treatment consist in, is precisely one of the fundamental questions that divides theories of social justice. Among the plausible answers, departing from Pogge's interpretation, is the idea that institutions treat people justly when they create and uphold the conditions for people to live autonomous lives or for people to stand as equals in a community. Okay? So Pogge's picture portions out institutional impact according to some idea of equality, or better, I haven't talked about this aspect of his work, but human rights-based health sufficiency view. So it's going to portion out institutional impact according to some normative ideal, and we may call this for short an equal impact view. Equality is a consideration from the supply side of the institutions, what they do to people, how they treat people. Relational egalitarianism will have a very different idea of what just institutional treatment amounts to, because it's about promoting and upholding equal standing. So it is equality promoting. It's not about the equal impact of institutions, but it's about the equality promoting effect of institutions from the point of view of the recipient. And this takes me to the third picture of global health justice. So this is what I call, in this stage, towards a relational egalitarian account of global health justice. In the last part of my talk, I want to put forward some considerations towards a relational egalitarian account of global health justice. At its core lies the idea of equal standing in global affairs, and the injustice of health inequalities is worked out in relation to this ideal. When I say what is owed to persons is equal standing in global affairs, I do not mean, and here's some quick clarifications, I do not mean that every person has to march in a global demonstration, having the internal and external capacity to participate in global affairs or economic affairs, political affairs, but it's about having the opportunity for one to do it if one chooses to. Having a job, being able to contribute to the global economy or to the social and cultural reproductive sphere, public political affairs or cultural affairs, one can opt out but may have to bear some of the distributional consequences. It is about enabling rather than disabling global institutional and cultural environment. There is no assumption of active global citizenship behind it, but an opportunity to participate. And the global social basis of such an equal standing expresses the idea of equal concern on the part of global policies and institutions for the life prospects of all. So what are these 5 or at least 4 elements of the normative structure that I'm envisioning here? First, the role of health. as I've said in the introduction already. Firstly, rather than locating the value of equality among persons in a particular distribution of health or health-related goods, it locates the value of equality in what it means to stand as equals vis-à-vis one another as members of the global community. The distribution of health, as well as other goods, is constitutive of that ideal, and the substantive requirement, what we owe to each other, is derived from careful examination of what the ideal itself entails. So health in this respect is not special. It is a very important and fundamental constitutive element of our equal standing in society, or in the global affairs in this case. It is not the distribution of health per se, but our relations, our ability to stand as equals is what matters morally. What sort of health-related distributions are relevant from the point of view of equal standing is what we're trying to come up with, sort of a list here. Okay, so the second point, origins, how we think about the origins of ill health when we're taking this relational egalitarian mode. Rather than focusing on and morally trying to distinguish between the natural, social, and self-inflicted origins of ill health, this view is concerned with how institutions deal with the effects of various sources of ill health on persons' overall standing in society. It elaborates a response to what it means for institutions to treat persons as having this equal standing, and implications for addressing health deprivations of multiple sources. Actually, as I said, this view is going to be blind to the origins of ill health, but only up to this certain threshold of equal standing, of being an autonomous agent in the global society. The third element, the site of global health justice. I need to stress that here in the site of justice there's this quite strong departure from Pogge. We're moving from this institutional impact and the priority of social origins, we move from this institutional impact towards an institutional enabling of equal standing in global affairs. And this is going to be crucial because it will allow us to extend considerations of justice to some natural health inequalities as well. Right? So this allows the relational egalitarian to take more seriously purely natural health deprivations. What matters is not how natural inequalities occurs, or what kind of biological impairment people are born with. Whether an impairment becomes a disability or not depends on a person's external resources, and more importantly, how these biological impairments interact with the physical and social environment it finds itself. So this view partly draws on, maybe it already rings a bell, this view partly draws on the influential social determinants of health approach and its extension to international determinants of health. According to the Marmot Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, where systematic differences in health are avoidable by reasonable action, they are quite simply unfair. It is this what we label health inequity. Putting right these inequities, the huge and remediable differences in health within and between countries is a matter of social justice. Elsewhere, Marmot adds that the unnecessary disease and suffering of the disadvantaged, whether in poor countries or rich, is a result of the way we organize our affairs in society. End quote. So in the social determinants of health model, health inequalities are unfair or unjust if and when they are reasonably avoidable through alternative social organization. This understanding of avoidability as socially, institutionally remediable health inequalities draws a very different picture of health injustice. So how does this site become a particular global site of justice? How should we think about global health inequalities and global health justice if we place the value of equality in equal relational standing in global affairs? Insofar as global rules and international practices are consequential for health deprivations, what shape these rules and institutions take and how they impact people's life and health prospects is of moral concern and a relevant subject of moral assessment. This moral assessment is a relational egalitarian one when it scrutinizes the terms and effects of global arrangement with a focus on whether this institutional treatment is an expression of equal concern and whether its impact on the distribution of health supports or undermines our equal standing. A prominent study conducted by the Lancet University of Oslo Commission in 2014 has shifted our attention to the global and political nature of health. The study argues that, quote, major drivers of ill health lie beyond the control of national governments and also outside the health sector, end quote. How the world is organized, which social and political norms prevail in global governance and transnational interactions, and who has a say in shaping them, systematically affects health equity. The study examines 7 key global governance areas with significant consequences for health, and concludes that they systematically exacerbate health inequalities and skew health burdens towards the poorest and the most vulnerable groups in the world. The complex pathways through which the norms, policies, and practices of global governance determine health outcomes across the global population are coined in this study the global political determinants of health. It includes factors diverse such as the global system of food production and markets, food markets, intellectual property regimes, foreign direct investment, financial governance and austerity policies, illegal migration regimes, and armed conflict. And this study, by analyzing these complex pathways of the global political determinants of health, it provides a significant insight into how each of them affects health inequalities in a systematic way. These global political determinants of health inequalities constitute, in this picture, the site of justice, or the site of global health justice. The subject of moral assessment is the way these global rules and practices express or not equal respect for persons and generate health inequalities. If health outcomes are greatly determined by how we organize our global affairs, the normative challenge is how can we envision a fair reorganizations of these terms of global cooperation. Okay, now to the fourth element, the grounds, how to ground our duty of global health. The core of this idea is equal standing vis-à-vis these global cooperative arrangements. And of course the problem is that a lot of people, even those relational egalitarians that are on board with the idea of relational egalitarian understanding of health within the domestic context, are skeptical whether this idea can be extended to the global realm, and partly the skepticism stems from observing lack of solidarity, lack of ideas of global equality or global distributive equality, and basically it's lack of taking any kind of foothold in the global public arena. And mainly the idea of relational equality, most prominently developed by Elizabeth Anderson, Samuel Scheffler, and others, and it has been developed in the context of democratic societies. So it is difficult to see how it could have a normative foothold, first in the global realm, with these very weak commitments of solidarity, and the other problem is that it may be possible to argue that equal standing or equal treatment is owed to those that contribute to these global cooperative affairs, and perhaps extended to children as potential future contributors, as well as to the elderly who are past contributors. But what about those who are too sick, too poor, or lack the relevant skills and abilities to contribute to these cooperative affairs? How can we ground the idea that justice and not charity or not humanitarian concern is what is owed to them? So here in this last section I draw on an idea of what I call contributive capacity-based reciprocity, and I developed this in my work on labor and global justice. The departure from contribution-based reciprocity is precisely the idea that equal standing of persons is not attached to their actual contribution to the social product. So the question is whether who are the persons who are owed equal concern, who are the persons who are owed justice. It has nothing to do with the idea that persons have capacity to contribute to the social product. Instead, this idea acknowledges the morally arbitrary distribution of natural capacities, talents, aptitudes, predispositions to ill health, and others. Moreover, it recognizes, and I think this is the more important part, that a person's capacity to contribute to a cooperative scheme depends in part on the design of the cooperative framework and the rules that govern the production and the distribution of social goods. On the contributive capacity-based reciprocity view, justice is concerned with the justifiability of overall life prospects, and the site of justice is the institutional structuring of these prospects. The terms on which social goods are produced and the way the production process confers value on the talents and abilities of individuals must be justified from a benchmark of equality. So justice is owed not only to those who can contribute to global affairs, but also to those who have been excluded or have been marginalized, given that their talents, skills, ways of life, or value system has been devalued or rendered insignificant in a particular design of a cooperative scheme, such as the global economy. Okay, so as I said, these are the four elements that try to motivate our shift towards a relational egalitarian understanding of global health justice. And to conclude, although there is a long way to go before we can make concrete policy suggestions on relational egalitarian grounds, a few considerations are already clear. The way we arrange, design, and reform our health-related global affairs goes well beyond the global health sector and needs to include a global health equity impact assessment with global relational equality at its normative core. First, the key global political determinants of health need to incorporate a requirement of equal concern and standing for all, which points to a presumption of equality in their distributive effects on health. So that's the first thing. Even though a positive principled solution involves some theoretical controversies, however the inequality constraint is specified, it provides the ground to object to current arrangements that generate health deprivation and exacerbate the disease burden at the lower ends of global inequality. Second, relational equality has important consequences for purely natural health deprivations, genetic disease, natural disasters, and so on. It does not provide the normative ground to compensate for or neutralize all global health deprivations. What it does require is that the way global institutions deal with the effects or mitigate the effects of natural ills is governed by the idea of treating people as equals, including each person having the capacities that enable them to function as equals in the global community. The second requirement, I think, provides plenty of ground to object to global institutional arrangements that leave unaddressed the plight of millions of people with serious but preventable diseases, leaving them at the brink of human existence rather than enabling them to be members of the global community in equal standing. Thank you.